Hi there, Marisa Murray here with your executive self-coaching tip for this week. This week's tip is actually inspired by my interpretation of Brené Brown's work in The Gifts of Imperfection in combination with some of my coaching training. And what really came together for me is in coaching we talk a lot about how do we maintain that really resourceful state, which is basically the state where we feel free to express ourselves, we feel free to take action, we feel like we have access to all of our tools in our toolkit. So that's when you're really productive. And in coaching, we work a lot on how do we stay in that productive state? And also, what do we do when we feel unproductive? How do we get back into that productive state? And when I was personally reflecting on the times when I'm not as productive as I'd like to be, or not as effective as I'd like to be, or I just frankly have this feeling that I'm fighting against the wind, like the wind is not in my sail. When I scanned back to see what was I feeling at those times, what came across to me very strongly was one of the most effective ways to get me off my game was when I was feeling either guilt or shame. And so today I'm going to talk about guilt and shame, and I'm going to talk about how to solve for your guilt and shame. What are the actions that you can take to work through that? And what I found as I applied this to my work, it was super effective to help me get over unresourceful state. So let me just explain why I want you to think about the difference between guilt and shame. And the reality is they feel almost the same for me in that, like, I feel bad, I feel sluggish, I don't feel great. So I'm going to ask you to think about the difference between the two, not because they're going to feel differently to you, just because actually the medicine for them is different. So for instance, if guilt is like a cold and shame is like the flu, you need to know that because the medicine that you're going to take for both of them to get them behind you is going to be different. So guilt is really when we feel like we've done something wrong. So guilt is when we handled a meeting poorly, we were too aggressive with somebody inappropriately, we didn't do our best work on something. Guilt is usually associated with doing, and it's often associated with doing something to someone. So for instance, we often feel guilty because of suboptimal interaction with an individual. So we feel guilty related to a person. Shame, on the other hand, is also when you feel bad, but where guilt would be someone maybe disappointed in you, shame is like, I'm disappointed in myself. So shame is things like, I didn't do my best work, I don't even know if I have the skills for this job, I don't even know why I have this job. You know, it's like I'm bad or I'm not able to do this. So it's I. So when you're feeling shame, it's less directed towards others, it's more directed internally, okay? So now that we know the difference between guilt and shame, I just want to tell you one thing that's super similar about them. The first thing that's super similar about them is they get worse with time. So if you learn nothing from this tip, just know that if you feel guilt or shame, taking action against solving your guilt and shame is something that you need to prioritize. I try to not let a day go by without dealing with any kind of sprouts of guilt or shame, because the reality is it ferments with time and it gets way worse. So the first thing to remember is do this stuff quickly. The second thing to remember is that guilt needs action and shame needs empathy. So guilt needs action. So what actions am I talking about? So if you feel guilty, there's a couple of different things that you can do. And what I would encourage you to do is just pick the ones that feel doable for you. So I'm going to give you a few different options. So guilt, the best thing for guilt, if you feel guilty that you've done something bad to somebody, the best thing is to apologize and own it. That's the best thing you can do. The challenge with this in a work context is, depending on your work culture, you may not feel comfortable doing this. You may not feel comfortable because in our resource-constrained work environments these days, sometimes we're worried about showing any vulnerability or fault. So the best thing you can do is actually apologize and own it directly to the individual. If you cannot do that, there are other things you can do. One is just deliberately be overly kind. So I'm sure you've seen people do this, where they're a little harsh with you and then the next day you get this email about how great you are. That is one mechanism to relieve your guilt. So just go back to them and catch them doing something good, do something for them. And the important thing here is for you to link it in your mind. So for you to be like, I'm going to do these things because I didn't behave well yesterday, and link that so that you release the guilt. So apologize, be extra kind, give them a little bit of a gift, and I'll even give you a fourth. If you cannot see the person, if this is old guilt, if this is really harsh guilt, if you can't even get yourself anywhere near them because it's just impossible, just do a random act of kindness for somebody else then. Do whatever you have to do and declare it. Pay for someone's parking or buy the person behind you a coffee in line and declare it as, I'm going to do this good gesture into the world because I need to relieve myself of this bad gesture. Okay, so that's how we handle guilt. Shame, on the other hand, is different. Shame needs empathy. Shame doesn't need empathy with the person or the context or even the individuals that you may have had an interaction with. Say, for instance, you're on a deal team and you really feel like you didn't lead the team very well and you just feel like you're the worst leader in the world. Shame doesn't necessarily need you to go to that team. That team probably won't actually give you a lot of empathy. That team will probably be annoyed that they lost, right? So shame doesn't need you to go and meet those people. Shame needs you to take care of yourself. So shame needs empathy in personal relationships where people are going to say, you know what? I get it. Don't worry. You're bigger than that. People that see you as big, that know that this is like a blip on the screen, like this is not who you are, and this was a moment in time. So shame needs sunlight, and it needs sunlight from someone who holds you big so that you can, release that. Shame festers and grows with time, secrecy, silence, replaying in your head, and just don't give it that luxury. Shame gets worse if you share with the wrong person. So you have to find the right people that are going to say, you know what, you're bigger than this and you're good and whatever. And again, just declare it. Say, I felt this, I've had this moment to regroup, and now I'm back in my game. And I really want to encourage you this week to just reflect on the backlog of guilt and shame that's plaguing your day, because when we don't deal with it, we can derail our careers. When you have unsolved issues, you start doing really irrational things that you don't even realize. It starts impacting your performance management. It starts impacting who you put on certain teams. It starts performing the way in which you show up for your customers or the way you manage your suppliers. So the reason why this is super important is because if you handle it, you can continue doing excellent work. And if you deny it or ignore it, you can actually really derail your career. So I hope this helps. I hope you guys kind of get into action either by finding empathy for shame or by taking goodwill actions to solve your guilt. And have a great week.